I wasn't looking for this. That's the thing I keep coming back to. I wasn't looking for this at all. It was a Wednesday night in November. I can't remember the exact date, but I remember the cold. My old radiator in the Oxford flat was making that particular clicking sound it makes in early winter, the kind of sound that means it's working but not very hard. I had been at my desk for nearly 3 hours, deep into a specific section of the Testament of Solomon, the section on the 36 deacons. 36 celestial entities, each assigned a different form of affliction, each interrogated by Solomon himself during the construction of the temple. I had my notes spread across the desk, 2 empty cups of tea on my left, and I was in that particular state of focused exhaustion where you're still reading carefully, but your defenses are lower than usual, where the text gets in more easily than it would if you were fresh. And then a dog started howling outside. Not barking. Howling. That sustained, low, almost melodic sound that's entirely different from a bark in a way that is difficult to explain, but completely impossible to mistake once you've heard it. And I sat there completely still, because I had been reading, literally just reading, 30 seconds earlier, about dog-headed demonic entities in a manuscript written 2,000 years ago. The coincidence landed like something physical. But I kept reading, and I found the line. When the master of the house hears this sound at night, he must not wait for morning. I had to read it 3 more times to make sure I was parsing the Greek correctly, because what the text was describing wasn't a philosophical position or a metaphorical suggestion or a theological meditation. It was an instruction, an imperative, an immediate, specific action protocol that Solomon, the man who had interrogated demons personally, who had learned their names and their vulnerabilities and had sealed them in copper vessels, had left behind for anyone who heard a dog howl in the darkness outside their home. I hadn't been looking for that. I had been researching the 36 deacons. This found me. I'm Emeka. I studied ancient Near Eastern languages at SOAS, the School of Oriental and African Studies in London, and then spent 12 years researching Solomonic manuscripts across Ethiopia, Israel, Egypt, and Nigeria. My mother was Igbo from Nsukka. My father was a British historian of ancient religions at UCL. I grew up in the gap between his academic skepticism and her absolutely unshakable spiritual knowledge. And I've spent the last 2 decades discovering that the gap between those 2 worlds is much smaller than either of them believed. What I found that Wednesday night in November changed how I hear the dark, and I'm not sure I can hear it the old way anymore. Before I go further, if this kind of discovery resonates with you, the kind that rearranges something you thought was already settled, subscribe. The algorithm needs to know you want more of this, because I have many more nights like that one, many more manuscripts that won't let me go, and I'm going to keep coming back to tell you what I found. Let me be precise about the source, because precision is what separates this from folklore. The Testament of Solomon is one of the most extraordinary texts that most people have never encountered. It's classified as pseudepigraphical, written in the style and voice of Solomon, but composed sometime between the 1st and 5th centuries of the Common Era, drawing on traditions and oral material that go back considerably further. It was almost certainly used by actual practitioners of Jewish and early Christian protective ritual. It is not canonical scripture, but it is ancient, it is serious, and it is extraordinarily specific in a way that separates it from allegorical religious writing. The text describes Solomon's encounter with demons during the construction of the Jerusalem temple. God gives him a ring, a signet ring with a specific seal, the seal of Solomon that you may have seen reproduced in later traditions. And with that ring, Solomon can summon any demonic being, learn its true name, its function, what afflictions it causes, and crucially, what binds it, what stops it, what it cannot withstand. He goes through dozens of these beings, one by one. It reads almost like a bureaucratic record. Name, form, function, binding. And the matter-of-fact quality of it is, honestly, more unsettling than any dramatic treatment of these subjects I've ever encountered in 12 years of working with ancient manuscripts. Solomon isn't frightened of what he's dealing with. He isn't amazed or awestruck. He's gathering intelligence. He's doing the work of someone who understands that knowledge about an adversary is the most important protection against it. One of those beings is called scepter, rhabdos in the Greek. When scepter appears before Solomon, the text records something specific. He came in the form of a giant dog. Not metaphorically, not in a visionary sense. The text says he manifested as a giant dog. And when Solomon interrogates him about his activities, Scepter declares, and I want you to hear this carefully, that his power operates specifically at night, that his domain is household movement, that his presence registers as a wrongness in the atmosphere around a home, a pressure, a quality of spiritual disturbance that the inhabitants may experience as inexplicable, heaviness, dread, or anxiety, without a discernible source. A sense that the air itself has changed quality. Then there are the 36 deacons. The deacons are the 36 10-degree segments of the zodiac, celestial beings absorbed into Solomonic demonology from Egyptian and Babylonian astrological tradition that was already ancient by Solomon's time. When Solomon interrogates them in the Testament, they arrive in forms described as having heads shaped like dogs, without clear human form. Each governs a different affliction: physical illness, nightmares, confusion of mind, uncontrolled fear, inexplicable anger directed at those we love. 36 entities, all with the heads of dogs, all operating in the night. And outside my window that November evening, a dog was still howling. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment, sitting at my desk with those two realities colliding. Not fear exactly. Something that was in the same family as fear, but wasn't quite it. A kind of heightened alertness. The very specific alertness that comes when you realize you might be holding something that actually matters. Not theoretically. Actually. In the specific and present sense of the word. So I had the connection. The Testament of Solomon explicitly links canine form with demonic entities that operate at night, and specifically in household environments. But the instruction I had found, "Don't wait for morning," was a single line in a single manuscript, and a single line is not enough. I needed it to exist in more than one source before I was willing to treat it as anything beyond a scribal peculiarity. An interesting note from a text that was in many ways an unusual document even by the standards of its own tradition. I went looking for corroboration, and the first place I looked honestly frustrated me. I spent close to 40 minutes going through secondary scholarly literature on the Testament, comparative religion papers, textual analyses, academic commentaries published in peer-reviewed journals. Good scholarship. Careful and defensible work done by people who knew the field. Almost all of it treating the dog imagery as symbolic, derived from ancient associations between dogs and death, liminal space, the boundary between the living and the dead, the dog as psychopomp, the dog as guardian of the underworld. Familiar territory. Nothing wrong with any of it, but it was analyzing the mythology without asking what people actually did with it. Every paper I was reading was treating the text as a literary artifact, something to be interpreted, contextualized, situated in the history of religious ideas. None of them were engaging with it as what it clearly was on its own terms, a practitioner's manual. A document written for people who needed to do something, not just understand something. And the difference between those two orientations is not minor. It is everything. A first aid manual and a medical history of first aid are both about the same subject. Only one of them tells you what to do when someone is bleeding in front of you. I almost stopped there. I want to be transparent about that, because I think intellectual honesty requires it. It was past midnight. The dog outside had gone quiet. I had a chapter deadline in 3 days, and I had already given 4 hours to what was supposed to be a 1-hour detour into a section I thought I understood. The rational thing, the thing my father, the historian, would have said gently, with the particular patience he had for moments when emotion interfered with method, was to close the laptop, note the instruction, add it to the chapter, sleep. But I couldn't release that line. He must not wait for morning. Because that phrase has a time component that isn't decorative writing. The morning is not just late. It is specifically too late. Something about the night is exactly and precisely relevant to the protocol. And Solomon hadn't written that because he was afraid of the dark or prone to dramatic rhetorical effects. He wrote it because he had spoken personally with the beings that use the dark, learned their operational patterns from direct interrogation, and knew with the precision of a researcher what the time constraint was and why. So I went to the Psalms. Psalm 59 stopped me completely cold. I had read it before, obviously. I grew up in a household where the Psalms were practical tools, not devotional decoration. My mother used them. She had specific psalms for specific situations in the way that someone with a well-organized kitchen has specific tools for specific tasks. Not interchangeably, not casually, but with the knowledge of what each one actually did. But I had never read Psalm 59 with the dog-headed entities of the Testament of Solomon fresh in my mind, and when I did, something opened in the text that I had genuinely never seen before. David writes, and I'm using the King James translation here, which preserves the imagery in a way that later modernizations sometimes soften. He writes, "Each evening they come back, howling like dogs and prowling about the city." Howling like dogs, coming back each evening. Prowling. This is David using the image of dogs howling at night to describe the spiritual forces that move against the righteous, not human enemies. This psalm is specifically about protection against a pressure that cannot be fought with a sword or reasoned with or appealed to through negotiation. The dog howling in the darkness is, in David's vocabulary, the auditory signature of something that doesn't belong where it's standing. Something that has arrived in the space around a home and whose presence the night makes possible in a way the daylight does not. And here's what crystallized something for me. David and Solomon are father and son. The Solomonic tradition didn't emerge from nothing. It emerged from a living lineage of people who had been developing these ideas across generations, each one building on what the previous generation had learned, each one adding precision and specificity to what had come before. What David encodes in Psalm 59 is the same perceptual truth that Solomon encodes in the Testament 3 generations later. They are describing the same phenomenon from positions separated by roughly 50 years in history. And the fact that they arrived at the same image, the howling dog as the sound of spiritual danger moving through the night, is not a coincidence. It is a tradition being transmitted accurately. The dog's howl is the sound of something your eyes cannot see. Then I went to Psalm 91. If you've spent any time in the African church tradition, or in Talmudic study, or in serious engagement with the Jewish prayer tradition, you'll know that Psalm 91 occupies a specific and unusual category. The Talmud classifies it as the song against evil spirits, the psalm designated for protection against what moves in darkness, what operates outside the visible, what the body perceives before the mind has language for it. In the open prayer commentary tradition, Rav Zalman Schachter Shalomi identified its original purpose as specifically anti-demonic, written to be recited aloud against entities that operate in nocturnal space. This isn't a modern interpretive addition. It's in the oldest layers of how this psalm was understood and used by the tradition that preserved it. 2 psalms, both in David's own voice. One uses dogs howling at night as the defining image of spiritual danger. The other is the designated protective response to exactly that category of threat. and sitting between them, connecting them, giving them their context. The instruction from the Testament of Solomon. When the master of the house hears this sound at night, he must not wait for morning. I was at my desk at nearly 1 in the morning, and something was arranging itself in my understanding that I hadn't expected when I'd sat down earlier to study deacons. And then something shifted in how I was reading all of it. I had been treating the dog as part of the problem. The demonic dog. The prowling enemy. The creature associated with the underworld, with liminal danger, with forces that shouldn't be standing in the space around your home. But wait. No, that's not right. Or rather, it's right about the wrong thing. The actual dog outside your window is not the threat. It is the instrument of perception that detects the threat. It is the sensor, the alarm system. Let me be very precise about this distinction, because it changes everything about what Solomon's instruction means and why his urgency makes sense. The reason the demonic entities in the Testament of Solomon appear with dog heads is not because they are dogs. It's because they share a specific quality with dogs. That quality is the ability to perceive across a threshold that human beings cannot naturally cross. The dog-headed deacons exist at the boundary between the visible and the invisible, between the material world and what acts upon it. Their canine form is a map of their perceptual nature. They dwell in the in-between, and the ancient tradition's description of their physical appearance reflects their function rather than their biology. And the actual dog, the living animal, occupies the same boundary from the other side. The dog doesn't howl because it is afraid. It howls because it has perceived something that requires communication, a signal that must cross a threshold your own senses aren't built to detect. In the Igbo cosmological tradition that my mother Nsukka lived by, not as abstract philosophy, but as daily navigated reality, the night is a space where forces that are ordinarily quiet become active. The visible world doesn't cease to exist after dark, but the invisible world becomes louder. Animals attuned to both worlds are not just co-inhabitants of the dark, they are translators. They perceive something and they tell you. They have no other way to tell you, so they use the sound that crosses every barrier, the voice. The howl is not superstition. It is data. And Solomon, who had sat across from Scepter and interrogated all 36 dog-headed deacons and learned their names and functions and movement patterns, understood precisely what that data signified. He hadn't just cataloged the entities for the sake of theological scholarship. He had learned their behavioral signatures, their arrival indicators. What the world sounds like and feels like and smells like when they are present in the space around a home. A dog howling near your home at night, sustained and directed rather than random, the howl that is different in quality from ordinary barking in a way you can feel in your sternum, is one of those signatures. And the instruction is, do not wait for morning. The complete protocol is not written as a list in any single manuscript. I assembled it from 3 sources that agree in their components, even when they don't know they're agreeing with each other. The Testament of Solomon, the Psalmic protective tradition in its oldest layers, and the practical spiritual knowledge my mother carried from Nsukka. The agreement between them is not manufactured. It is the agreement that happens when independent traditions have been observing the same phenomenon across centuries and arriving, through different paths, at the same set of conclusions. Step 1. Conscious acknowledgement. You hear the sound and you do not dismiss it. You do not roll over. You do not pull the pillow over your head and tell yourself it is just an animal being an animal. You register the signal consciously and deliberately. You say, with your full attention fully present, I hear this. This acknowledgement is not a passive cognitive act. It is the first active choice of the protocol. The tradition holds that deliberate inattention, choosing to consciously ignore what you have recognized, is itself a form of decision with consequences. Not acknowledging is not the same as neutral. It is the choice to leave a signal unanswered. Step 2. Physical movement. You get up. This is not a lying down prayer. Every tradition I found on this subject is consistent about moving your body toward the threshold of your home. Not in aggression, not in fear, but in presence. You go to the entry of your home. You face the direction the sound is coming from. The standing posture, the forward orientation, the deliberate physical positioning at the boundary of your space. These are active postures. The body is saying, before the voice says anything, I am here. I am awake. I am present at the boundary of this household. The spiritual geography of Solomonic practice is extraordinarily body conscious. Where you stand matters. How you are oriented matters. The physical and the spiritual are not separate domains with one affecting the other at a distance. They are in constant contact, and your body is always part of what you bring to any spiritual action. Step 3. Psalm 59, spoken aloud. Not thought about. Not read silently. Spoken out loud into the air. The words that David wrote using the image of dogs howling at night are now being spoken back against what caused the howling. This is the kind of precision the tradition was built on, using the exact language of the problem as the language of the response. You are deploying words from within the tradition against what the tradition identifies as the source of the signal. The loop closes. The vocabulary that named the danger becomes the vocabulary that addresses it. Step 4. Psalm 91, 7 recitations. 7 is the number of spiritual completion in the Solomonic and Kabbalistic traditions. The number of fullness, the number that completes a cycle, the number that appears throughout the ancient record at moments of protective sealing. You recite facing outward, into the space beyond your threshold. The psalm that the ancient tradition designated specifically for this category of threat, the song against evil spirits, spoken 7 times into the night air. Step 5. The sealing of the threshold. This is the element the Solomonic tradition is most emphatic about, and it is the one that most directly connects to Solomon's own practice as described across multiple sources. He was, above all else, obsessed with thresholds, doorways, windows, gates, the points where the inside and the outside meet, where the protected space and the unprotected space share a boundary. Because the entities he interrogated are obsessed with thresholds too. They move through openings. They use the boundaries of spaces as their routes of entry. The sealing is the spoken declaration of the divine name at the threshold of your home, the placement of something at the boundary that the tradition identifies as uncrossable by what you are sealing against. It is not a lock. It is a declaration of what this space belongs to, and therefore what cannot enter it. The full protocol takes perhaps 15 to 20 minutes if you're not rushing it. The tradition recommends not going immediately back to sleep. Sitting with what you've done. Letting the action be real rather than a ceremony performed while half-conscious and already checking the time. My mother in Nsukka knew every step of this. She wouldn't have needed the Testament of Solomon to explain it to her. She just knew. That night in November, after I had traced all of this, the deacons, scepter, Psalm 59, Psalm 91, the protocol assembled from 3 independent sources agreeing with each other across centuries. I went to my window. The dog was still there, across the street, near the park. Not howling anymore, just present in the dark, the way a dog sometimes is. That particular stillness that is more alert than rest, more watchful than sleep. I stood at the window for a while, and I thought about what I was going to do. I want to be very careful about how I describe what followed, because I am not trying to perform courage or spiritual conviction for you. I am trying to tell you honestly what happened when a man who believes in evidence and argument, who has built a career on the proposition that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, decided whether or not to take a 2,000-year-old instruction seriously in his own life and not just in his research notes. I went to the front door of the flat. I opened it slightly, just enough. It was cold. Genuinely cold. The kind of Oxford November cold that finds the gap between your collar and your neck before you've had a chance to brace for it. The dog was across the road and I could see it faintly, just a shape in the darkness near the park gate, and I spoke Psalm 59 into the night air. Quietly, because it was 1 a.m, and I have neighbors who have not chosen to involve themselves in this research. Then I spoke Psalm 91, 7 times, and I closed the door. Here is what did not happen. Nothing dramatic. No visible response. No portentous silence. No resolution that would have worked as the ending of a story told for effect. I went back to my desk and sat there for a while, and then I went to bed. But here is what did happen, and this is the price. And I need you to understand this with precision. I cannot unhear a dog howling at night anymore. That capacity, the capacity to hear that sound and file it as ambient noise, as the random behavior of a city animal, as something entirely disconnected from anything beyond the physical biology of a dog expressing itself at night. That capacity is gone. It did not leave gradually, eroded over time by accumulating knowledge. It left that night. The night the research and the experience happened in the same room at the same moment. Now when I hear a dog howling in the dark, there is a pause in me. A recognition. A sense that the animal is doing something that is not random. That it has perceived something moving in the space around a home that its nervous system is built to detect, and that mine is not. And I have to make a choice about whether to respond to what it's communicating. Every time. That choice does not leave you. Once you know what the sound might signify, once you've read what Solomon said about it and understood the mechanism behind it and traced it through the Psalms and the African tradition and your own mother's practice, the sound cannot go back to being just a sound. It has acquired meaning that you cannot unacquire. Knowledge doesn't work backward. You can choose not to act on what you know, but you cannot choose to unknow it. You do not unlearn this. You learn to carry it. Some nights that feels like a burden. The interruption of sleep, the weight of decision, the question of whether you're taking something too seriously or not seriously enough. Some nights it feels more like a responsibility, like knowing something that very few people still know in an explicit, articulated, actionable form, and being someone who acts on it rather than someone who rolls over and decides the night is just silence. What I have not resolved, and I want to be genuinely honest that I have not resolved it after several years of living with this, is which of those it actually is. I'm not sure the distinction is stable. Some nights it shifts within the same hour. I just know that I do it, and that I am not the same person I was before I found that line in the Testament of Solomon at 1 a.m. in Oxford, while a dog howled outside and I was supposed to be writing a chapter about something else entirely. I started that evening trying to understand why 36 celestial entities would all manifest with the heads of dogs. That was the question I had written at the top of my notes. Why dogs? What is the significance of the canine form in a tradition that is otherwise so careful about the specific attributes it assigns to specific entities? I understand now that I was asking a smaller question than I thought. The dog-headed deacons of the Testament, scepter arriving before Solomon in canine form, the howling dogs in Psalm 59. These are not separate pieces of imagery that happen to share a symbol by coincidence, or by the kind of cross-cultural borrowing that produces superficial similarities. They are the same observation made by different traditions across different centuries and different geographies, all arriving at the same conclusion through independent routes. The dog perceives what the human eye does not see, and the ancient world, from Solomon's Jerusalem to David's Psalms to my mother's morning practice in Nsukka, understood this not as superstition, but as a form of ecology, spiritual ecology. The animal kingdom and the unseen world are not separate and sealed domains that happen to exist in parallel without touching. They interact, they respond to each other. And the dog is one of the most reliable indicators of that interaction because the dog has spent close to 10,000 years in close enough proximity to human habitation that the two systems have developed a shared language. The dog communicates with sound because it lives in the same physical world we do. It just hears more of it than we do. My mother drew protective symbols on our doorframe in Nsukka. I can still see her doing it. Early morning, before anyone else was awake, tracing something in chalk or in ash that I couldn't read as a child and didn't think to ask about. As a child, I assumed it was tradition. Something she did because her mother had done it, and her mother before that. A line of practice stretching back into a past too distant to see the beginning of. When I was at SOAS studying ancient languages, I categorized it as cultural inheritance. Valuable, worth understanding and preserving, but pre-rational in the sense that mattered to the academic framework I was learning to inhabit. And then I found those same symbols in a manuscript in the British Museum basement. Not similar symbols, not conceptually related symbols with a family resemblance. The same symbols, in a document that predated my grandmother's birth by 17 centuries. And then I found the protocol in the Testament of Solomon. And then I understood something about my mother that I had been circling for years without quite landing on it directly. She wasn't practicing tradition in the sense of repetition without comprehension. She wasn't following a ritual whose meaning had eroded through generations of repetition until only the form remained and the understanding had been lost. She knew what the symbols did. She knew what the dog's howl at night meant. She knew what the instruction, "Don't wait for morning," was pointing at. Not because she had read the Testament of Solomon or the Psalmic protective commentaries or any of the secondary scholarship I was reading in the SOAS library, but because that knowledge had been carried through oral transmission for 2,000 years and had arrived intact in her hands in Nsukka, Nigeria, in the 1960s. I traveled to Ethiopia, I traveled to Egypt, I traveled to Israel. I spent years in archives and libraries and the basements of institutions. I compiled notes and cross-referenced sources and built arguments that my academic peers could evaluate and critique. She knew before breakfast, and the humility that produces in me is not small. It is one of the larger recalibrations of my intellectual life. The assumption that the written, academic, institutionally validated tradition is more reliable than the oral, practiced, lived tradition is an assumption I was trained into carefully and have been slowly trained out of by the evidence of my own research. The ancient manuscripts and my mother's knowledge are not in competition. They are different channels carrying the same current. So here is what I want to leave you with. Not a demand for belief, not an instruction to abandon your critical faculties or to stop asking questions about what you've just heard. I'm a researcher with a deep professional and personal discomfort with certainty that hasn't been earned through evidence. I would not be serving you well if I asked you to accept this without your own examination, but the next time a dog howls near your home at night, the sustained, directed, not random howl that is different from ordinary barking in a way that is difficult to articulate but possible to recognize once you're listening for it, I'm asking you to pause, not to be afraid. Fear is not the protocol. Fear is what you feel before you have tools. The protocol is not built on fear, it is built on recognition and deliberate response. There is a significant difference between those two orientations, and it matters for how you move. The dog has perceived something. The tradition that teaches you what to do when the dog perceives something is 3,000 years old, and it is specific. You go to your threshold, you face the direction of the sound, you speak the words that were written for exactly this situation by a man who interrogated the entities involved personally and knew their signatures better than any living scholar, including me. Psalm 59, Psalm 91. Your presence at the boundary, your voice going out into the dark before the morning, has a chance to make the question irrelevant. Solomon spent decades learning what moves in the night so that he could leave instructions for those of us who come after. He was not a superstitious man. He was one of the most careful and precise intelligences in the ancient record, and he documented what he knew with the precision of someone who expected his documentation to be used by real people in real situations. He wasn't writing for scholars. He was writing for the master of the house who hears something outside and needs to know what to do. When he said, "Don't wait for morning," he knew why morning would be too late. Sleep well tonight. Or don't. But if a dog starts howling out there in the dark, now you know what Solomon said to do. Before you go, if what I've shared in this video meant something to you, I want to tell you how you can help this work continue. I spend months in archives and libraries so that you can spend 12 minutes with what I found there. The manuscripts I work with don't come to me, I go to them. That means time, travel, and resources that don't pay for themselves through a university salary alone. If you send a super thanks on this video, it means I can keep making that journey. Back to the archives in Oxford, in London, in Addis Ababa. Instead of spending my energy on work that stopped mattering to me 20 years ago. You're not just a viewer. You're deciding what gets researched next. I have at least a dozen more findings that are keeping me up at night. Several of them are more unsettling than this one. One last thing. Has a dog ever howled near your home at night, and you felt something was wrong? Something you couldn't name? Something that the sound itself didn't fully explain? A feeling that the noise was a communication rather than just a noise? Write it in the comments, because I suspect I am not the only person who has stood at a cold door past midnight, deciding whether to take an ancient king's instruction seriously. Tell me what you felt. Tell me what you did. Tell me if this changes anything for you.